From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The University of California sues the United Auto Workers Local that represents graduate teaching assistants and other staff for what the school system says is an illegal strike, but that the union says is standing up for the rights of pro-Palestine demonstrators. Is this a growing divide in the left that could cause problems for the union movement and Democratic politicians like Joe Biden? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, Alicia Finley and Mene Ukwe-Barua. UAW Local 4811 represents about 48,000 teaching assistants, researchers, and other staff at 10 University of California campuses. According to the LA Times, it is now involved in a labor action that kicked off about 3 weeks ago at UC Santa Cruz, has now spread to about 6 campuses, including UCLA and UC Irvine. This is a piece of the statement from the University of California system. Melissa Matella, the Associate Vice President for System-Wide Labor Relations, says this is a blatant breach of the party's no-strike clause by UAW. It will continue to cause irreversible harm to the university, as it will disrupt the education of thousands of students in the form of canceled classes and delayed grades. She adds that it also endangers life-saving research in hundreds of laboratories across the university. The union, on the other hand, says that this is not related to the contract. This is a protest over the treatment of pro-Palestine demonstrators on campus. Let's listen to a bit of Mark Gradoni, a UC Irvine graduate student who teaches a class in world history, explaining why he is joining this labor action.
This is a moment of profound severity and importance, where we have to stand up and we have to tell the university that it has to abide by the law of this country, by the law of this state, and by our collective bargaining agreements that we fought for 6 weeks to win in 2022. The university has unilaterally changed our working conditions. They have targeted our members for speaking out and protected union activity and exercising our constitutional rights to free speech and freedom of assembly.
Alicia, what's going on out there at the University of California, and what do you make of this strike by the UAW?
So the UAW, which represents about 48,000 academic workers at the University of California, and this includes postdocs, teaching assistants, and various others, mostly actually grad students, authorized a strike last month. And as UAW, or the UCI member, noted that this actually isn't about working conditions or wages. This is actually about social and political issues. They claim that the protesters, the anti-Israel protesters, many of which were grad students, were unfairly treated, and they want amnesty. So they don't want any kind of disciplinary actions against any of these anti-Israel protesters, including the ones who barricaded themselves in offices and actually resorted in some cases to violence. But what they're also calling for, and they don't say this in their actual public complaint, but it's actually on their website, is that they also want divestment from the University of California retirement system or any other investments that the university makes from Israel. And they want to cut off any kind of scientific or any other research partnerships from Israel. And the University of California says, well, not so fast. We just struck a labor agreement with you guys 2 years ago. This was over the economic conditions that prohibits strikes. And so you are actually carrying on, or you are conducting an illegal strike. And it's not just illegal because it's not about working conditions. It's illegal because our labor agreement doesn't allow you to do this.
One thing that I think is important to discuss as background for this is the statistics on unionization in the United States, because, Mene, I think there's still a widespread impression that the typical union worker in the United States is in some kind of tough job working with their hands and steel mills and stuff like that. And that is not really, I think, any longer the case. The figures most recently are that about a third of public workers are unionized in the United States, and only about 6% of workers in the private economy. So 94% of workers at private companies, big businesses, small businesses, 94% of them are not unionized. And that ratio, I think, keeps increasing as the overall share of union workers in the economy goes down. It's going down on both sides of the ledger, but I think faster in the private workforce. If you go back and look at the numbers from 2000, about 37% of public workers were unionized and 9% of private workers. So almost 1 in 10 private workers in the year 2000. And again, now it's down to 6%. And so when you think of the union movement these days, Monet, it is not necessarily the United Auto Workers going and organizing an auto plant. Sometimes it's the United Auto Workers going and organizing the teaching assistants at the University of California system.
Exactly. I think when you look at the long-term decline of private unions, there's an economic factor in that. You saw a lot of the unionized industries finding it very hard to maintain profits and to keep employing workers and paying them good wages, in part because of the restrictions that the unions put on management's ability to innovate. A lot of those jobs ended up going overseas, and you've found a lot of workers in manufacturing today don't think that they're going to get a great deal out of joining up with the union, and so they choose to stay independent. You've also seen right-to-work laws in a lot of these states that make it feasible for workers in these industries to choose not to join unions, and over time that has led to many, many fewer of them joining up. And so taking the place of those old models of unions organizing these large manufacturing and other productive industries, they've shifted toward a more political strategy and tried to find workers who are willing to come on board, not necessarily because they think that there's going to be a big economic benefit to unionizing, but because they're essentially seeing unions as a way of affiliating with a left-wing political cause. And so that's exactly what you see with a lot of the grad workers. They want to push the university for better terms, but they also want to signal solidarity with a bunch of left-wing causes, including anti-Israel protests. It's also one of the reasons why you've seen unions spread at service industries like Starbucks, for example. You have a lot of university graduates who work in these cafes across the country. Some of them are underemployed, tend to be very progressive. Of course, they're hoping to get a little bit of a wage bump out of negotiating with management, but they also are signaling their affinity with the left by joining up with these unions. And so as the UAW and other unions have struggled to recruit members from their traditional industries, they've pushed more into these political identity fields, but that's led them down very strange roads. This union, which is supposed to be advocating the material interests of its workers, ends up being aligned with these very politicized protests. And it's kind of a conflict for a big organization like the UAW that's trying to represent starkly different types of workers in different industries across the country.
On the point about political identitarianism, though, and its focus for many of these new union members, Alicia, the Journal's editorial on the UC strike makes the argument that the UC is in some ways inviting these kinds of actions because it sets up these academic departments where their business is basically attracting activists and training activists. And then when those activists go out and engage in activism against the university that is hosting them, how can they be surprised? And I wonder what you make of that argument, Alicia.
One of the issues is that the universities have become increasingly reliant on, TAs and grad students who would describe themselves as equivalent to slave labor. I mean, they actually earn a decent amount at the University of California because of their strike 2 years ago. They actually now make around $34,000 for 9 months of work for part-time. So that's actually not bad. That's around $90,000 if you really consider it on an annual basis for full-time work. But a lot of universities and UCs and the bigger universities in particular have become more reliant on graduate students to not just help with grading assignments, which they've now increasingly relying on them to actually run classes and teach classes. So you have PhD candidates who are teaching these classes, hence they have more leverage. And the reason why the universities are doing this, by the way, is to save money. And of course, students and their parents probably haven't noticed these savings as tuition increases, but that's because the universities in turn hired more administrators. And so the reason why they are admitting, again, more graduate students is one, to save money, and two, in some cases, the master's students, the ones who have applied for master's programs, actually bring in money for universities because they are actually paying full freight. So they're actually, in some ways, a revenue stream for these universities. Now, this is a little bit of a tangent, but again, this is the reason why they are expanding and have these masses of graduate students who are now a little disaffected and are, in many cases, again, they are actually leading the protest. UC, like many other universities, requires personal statements and diversity statements for graduate applicants. And then when I looked this up, the UC's website specifically asked graduate applicants to explain their experiences that have deepened your understanding of the barriers facing ethnic minorities, women, and other underrepresented groups in higher education. And they must also highlight what they've done on issues of race, gender, equity, and inclusion. So the graduate admissions process, similar to the undergraduate admissions process, is increasingly focused not on actual scholarship, what the kinds of research, hard research that they've done, but actually like progressive and woke social causes and how have they promoted those. And so when you're kind of self-selecting this, you're self-selecting for progressive activists. And so you shouldn't be surprised when then they take over the quads or then they join with labor strikes or labor movement and hold strikes over social causes. I mean, I think that the university is essentially getting what it deserves.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. To pick up on your point before the break, Monet, about these big labor unions trying to do two very different things at once. The other context here is that the UAW has been trying to do an organizing drive into the South of traditional auto workers at these plants, including Mercedes and other foreign auto workers that have set up shop in the American South in recent decades. And there was a recent loss in May. The UAW did a vote at two Mercedes-Benz plants in Alabama and lost that vote 56% to 44%. And Monet, I wonder if what is happening now on the campus of the University of California helps feed that, because I can imagine myself being a traditional auto worker, going into the plant every day and pumping out cars. And then the union comes in and says, please join our UAW and we can help you get better wages and things like that. But then I see these kids at the University of California that are striking and blocking entrances and exits to academic buildings on campus because they're angry about what's happening in Gaza, and the UAW president is there making statements about Gaza. And I can imagine, again, as an auto worker, thinking, what does any of that have to do with me or my job or my paycheck?
Yeah, it's hard to tell exactly what that result in Alabama turned on. A lot of people were optimistic that the workers at these Mercedes plants would choose to join up because it was coming only a month after a successful vote at a Chattanooga plant where the UAW got its first ever victory at a foreign automaker in the South. But for one reason or another, the voters at these Mercedes plants chose not to join up. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if the politics was a factor for a lot of them. Obviously, the southern United States are a much more conservative place than some of the traditional havens of United Auto Workers, which are up in the Midwest. And a lot of the workers there probably did think maybe we'll get a nice wage bump out of this. But if they took a look at the politics of the union, not only do you have UAW members protesting in favor of Gaza, but the UAW endorsed Joe Biden and they donate millions upon millions of dollars to Democratic candidates across the country every single year. And so if you're joining up, you have to be comfortable aligning yourself with this political organization, which is supporting a whole bunch of causes that have nothing to do with their actual work. I think that a lot of the critics of the UAW did a good job of making that case. You saw governors of a lot of these southern states come out and write a letter before the vote in Alabama saying that not only does unionization threaten these very successful automakers and these industries that have helped to provide good jobs and good wages in our states, but also politically, this isn't who we are. This is something that Kay Ivey, the governor of Alabama, said, and I think it probably did hit home with a lot of workers who are deciding these organizations organizations are foreign to our culture. This is not something that represents the working class in Alabama the way that it might better represent university workers in California today. And so Shawn Fain has put himself in this very difficult position of trying to speak to vastly different constituencies as the UAW continues to lean into a more progressive base for its membership that could impede their ability to hold some of their traditional working class industrial base of workers too.
Alicia, what's your read of the UAW's attempt to push into the South? I guess my analysis is that there's a pretty good amount of churn in these kinds of numbers. So just to give an example, if you go and look at the statistics at the National Labor Relations Board, there were 160 decertification elections to decertify a union in the year 2023. And 110 of those were lost by the union. So about 2/3 of those elections, the union was in fact voted out. And so what happens is there's a high profile victory in a place like Tennessee, Chattanooga, that Volkswagen plant that Monet mentioned, and it gets all sorts of headlines. And the narrative is kind of created that the UAW is on its way into these plants. And then it came up short in Alabama.
Well, I think you hit it spot on that, again, it's really an artifact of what the press likes to highlight. If you look at the actual labor statistics, as we've been discussing, the unionization overall has been declining, and there are many reasons, including the shift to more service occupations. But the UAW has done a really good job, by the way, and also the SEIU and others have done a really good job of playing up their victories, and whether that be at a select plant or even a small Starbucks store or an Amazon warehouse, for instance, like in New York, while the overall numbers have declined. And some of that decline, by the way, is not just, the decertification votes. And I would imagine actually the decertification votes represent very small share of declining unionization. Most of it is just from attrition, or as Monet was mentioning, some of these jobs are moving overseas or actually to the South, the right to work states. And increasingly, as that happens, the non-unionized workforces at businesses become more competitive and more dominant. And so you're just seeing an economic-wide shift. But the press doesn't pay attention to that. Instead, they focus in on one plant or one Starbucks restaurant in order to promote this union-driven narrative that they are ascendant, that they are claiming victory. And the irony, I would say, is that President Biden likes to say that middle class has been hollowed out because of the declining unionization. And he keeps on reiterating that. So that almost actually contradicts this narrative that they are ascendant. Again, the NLRB and the Democratic politicians have really tried to change the rules in order to promote unionization and make it easier for workers at different employers to unionize. But the overall trend is the same, that there's been a decline, and that's because workers are actually choosing and employers are making choices that have resulted in lower unionization.